I'm going to start off this next session by speaking briefly by way of overview. But most of the papers, the real substance papers are going to be presented by these three folks over here, and we'll take them in order. But I have a few things that I would like to say. In a paper that is going to be published this summer in the journal Sociology of Religion, I asked what mechanisms make religious pluralism possible. What features of the social system make it possible for persons of diverse religious perspectives with different understandings of ultimate truth, different value priorities, and different codes of social behavior to live together in relative harmony, to interact in the context of shared public institutions, to express a sense of unity in response to public events that threaten to fragment the population along religious and ethnic lines. That paper explored several possible answers that I want to review briefly here. First, it's possible that public life in America has become so secularized that religion simply no longer matters. That is, religion doesn't matter as long as accountants can count, teachers can teach, carpenters can build, and politicians can dance the Texas sidestep. One way to make religious pluralism possible is to relegate religion to the realm of private life, making it inconsequential to the public realm. There's no doubt some truth in this answer. But as we have seen in the papers that we heard this morning, religion in Southern California matters a great deal. In Southern California, arguably one of the most secularized regions of the nation, religion makes a big difference in public affairs. In fact, Californians, like most Americans, tend to think that religion ought to have a voice in public affairs, that religion is a positive influence on public life. Another possible mechanism that might make religious pluralism possible is what sociologists who observe European institutional practices have called pillarization. Under such a system, diverse religions are accommodated by allowing religious groups, often with government subsidy, to set up parallel organizations such as parochial schools, Bible colleges, and faith-based social service providers, even political parties, to serve their own constituencies. Under such a system, adherents of different religions would have little or no need to interact with each other in the public realm unless they voluntarily chose to do so. I need hardly point out that there are advocates of such a system here in the United States and Southern California. Those who, for instance, advocate a system of publicly funded school vouchers, and those who support President Bush's proposal to use federal funds to support faith initiatives that serve religiously exclusive constituencies. A third possible institutional response to religious diversity deserves mention, although it hardly merits the name of pluralism, at least not in the sense in which we use that term in this project. That is, it's possible to give a particular religion a privileged place in public institutions and to treat adherents of other faiths as second-class citizens. Unfortunately, there also remain adherents or advocates of this response, even in Southern California, where it makes so little sense. But there's a fourth possibility, and it's this fourth possibility that we're exploring in this session. That is, to promote a civic culture that holds religious diversity to be a positive good, and to develop institutions that express these values in practice. To reiterate some of what I said last night, religious pluralism is more than just diversity. Religious pluralism is meaningful diversity. And we are here exploring the possibility that in Southern California, a civic culture is emerging that guides people's experience of religious diversity and prescribes certain kinds of response to that experience. The three papers that you are about to hear address this emerging civic culture in various ways, in the context of the interfaith movement, the public schools, and faith-based social service providers. Now, I'd like to continue with the remainder of my time, because when I say that pluralism is meaningful diversity, especially after hearing the remarkable presentation by Gustav Niebuhr last night, I think it's important that we understand how the meaning of diversity has changed over the course of American history, and that may help us to better understand the meaning of diversity that is emerging in the civic culture today. Americans didn't always look on religious diversity as a good thing. In the colonies and for much of the early part of American history, the dominant response to diversity was one of conquest, conversion, and exclusion. The most religious dissidents might hope for, at least in some, if not all of the colonies, was toleration. The principle of toleration, of course, assumed the existence of a dominant religious establishment, but urged that establishment not to use its powerful position to persecute religious minorities. All along, a more sincere pluralism had advocates, of course. James Madison, for instance, thought that diversity was a good protection against religious oppression. The greatest threat to interreligious harmony in his mind lay in the power of majorities to oppressed minorities, and a diversity of faiths might act as a counterbalance by preventing real majorities from ever taking form. Although Madison's thinking was the dominant influence on the First Amendment, however, his was not the majority opinion. His fight for religious disestablishment in the state of Virginia was a long and hard one, and the implications of the First Amendment for religious freedom in America unfolded only slowly over the next 2 centuries. Even after the last religious establishment was ended, when the state of Massachusetts disestablished the church, the Congregational Church, Americans were by no means agreed that religious freedom and consequent religious diversity was a good thing. As expressed by R. Lawrence Moore, throughout the 19th century, most Protestant evangelicals endorsed America's experiment in religious disestablishment, but at the same time they expected Americans to move toward a common faith, which they thought would resemble their own sectarian outlooks. They were prepared to tolerate diversity, but they did not regard diversity as in itself a good thing. The principle of toleration, which informed America's response to diversity during the colonial and early federal period, gave way during the 19th century to an ideology that recognized the fact of religious diversity, but looked forward to growing cultural and religious consensus. The image of a great melting pot, although not popularized until the first decade of the 20th century, captures the ideology of pluralism that dominated until the end of the 19th century. The idea was that the frontier experience and the experience of social life in America would melt the many peoples of America into a new race with a common culture. Often ignoring the reality of ongoing sectarianism in American religion, historians of the time told the story of growing national religious unity, expressed usually by the largest mainline denominations. Out of the many religions it was thought would grow one American church. Even the term denomination, which was eventually used to describe the structural style of American religious organization, reflects the assumption that the differences between the various religions of America were mostly nominal. That is, the religions were thought to be different in name, but not really in substance. Christian unity was believed to be the more fundamental reality that would eventually be realized in practice, and this idea gave rise to the ecumenical efforts to evangelize the nation. That goal of evangelizing the nation took on a new meaning at the turn of the 20th century, when a great wave of immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries brought large numbers of Eastern European Catholics and Jews to the United States who did not really fit very well into the existing denominational system. Protestant Americans feared the impact that these religious strangers might have on American society, and worried whether the new immigrants, most of whom did not speak English, maintained odd customs, ate strange foods, to say nothing of their religious commitments, could ever become good Americans. How could people who came from countries with established churches and monarchical governments ever learn the ways of religious freedom and democracy? The idea of assimilation was born amidst such nativist fears. Whereas the melting pot ideology was relatively patient, assuming that a common religious culture would emerge naturally over time, the assimilation ideology expressed a sense of urgency. It called for overt efforts to mold new immigrants into an imagined cultural consensus. And that assimilation ideology gave rise to some great public institutions, a system of publicly funded common schools, whose job it would be to educate not just immigrants, but all young Americans in the English language and the values and institutions of democracy. Given the prominent role of Protestant religion in informing American public values at the time, it was assumed that Protestant values would also constitute part of the public school life, if only in the neutralized form of daily prayer and Bible reading without theological comment. At the same time, a campaign of proactive evangelism represented a private voluntary component as expressed in the urban missions. At about the same time that common schools were being formed, the Salvation Army and the YMCA and other urban missions were taking off. The goal of these efforts was the assimilation of newcomers to the American way of life. The idea of assimilation was born then, not as an objective social scientific explanation of what happened to immigrant communities as a result of exposure to American society and culture, but as a normative model of how immigrants should respond to American society and would if schools, churches, and urban missions made the effort. Obviously, those immigrant communities that resisted assimilation were often perceived as dangerous and subversive. By implying that there was a normative way of being American, the assimilation ideology also gave rise to nativist reactions to religious, political, and cultural differences. If the idea of assimilation produced such venerable institutions as the Salvation Army, the YMCA, and the public school system, it also gave birth to the 100% American movement, the anti-Catholic movement, anti-Semitism, and a revived Ku Klux Klan. Looked at historically, what we see is a pattern of cultural response to religious diversity that is constantly changing and evolving in response to new circumstances, expanding at each phase of its development to accommodate an ever greater variety of religions in the United States. And this sets the backdrop against which contemporary responses to diversity can be viewed. Starting shortly after the Second World War, countercultural movements began to question the normative vision of American social life, and with it the assimilation ideology. The civil rights movement not only expressed dissatisfaction with racist beliefs in public policies, it revealed a fundamental problem with assimilationism, to the extent that the American way of life was normatively white and middle class. It was impossible for whole segments of the population to ever become fully American. The imagined consensus promoted by assimilationism could only be sustained by the exclusion of people with dark skin, non-European ancestries, and limited incomes. Other ethnic movements later on expressed a similar critique. These movements not only demanded practical changes in public policy, they demanded a transformation of American national self-identity. They insisted that Americans recognize themselves to be a pluralistic people, that there were diverse and legitimate ways of being American. At the same time, young middle-class Americans also began to challenge the imagined cultural consensus as being oppressive and restrictive. The free speech and anti-war movements, the beat and hippie movements, experimentation with exotic religions and consciousness-altering chemicals were attempts by those raised in American middle-class homes to break out of what they perceived as the bondage of the American way of life. They rejected the notion that being a good American meant conforming to a normative culture and lifestyle, and they asserted instead that being a good American sometimes means adopting the stance of an outsider and challenging the status quo. Throughout the 20th century, the legitimacy of the normative understanding of the American way of life was challenged both from the inside and from the outside by young, white, middle-class youth and by racial, ethnic, and religious minorities. This fact largely accounts for the dissatisfaction with assimilationism, which had as its logical end the very normative vision of the American way of life that these countercultural movements rejected. By the 1980s, the cultural construction of diversity was so far removed from the old assimilation model that R. Lawrence Moore observed that positioning oneself as an outsider to American culture had become the archetypal means of expressing one's Americanness. Although assimilationism still has its advocates, diversity and dissent have come largely to overshadow communitarian consensus in the civic culture. Assimilationism is not only seen as descriptively inaccurate, it is seen as normatively undesirable. Pluralism is coming into favor as the normative response to diversity. But what does pluralism look like in practice? Obviously, institutional practices reflect value choices. And if we want to better understand the values and the meaning of diversity that is emerging in the American civic culture, perhaps the best way is to look at the ways that some of the institutions are responding to the challenge of diversity, and that's what these next three papers are about.
In the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America, added in 1789 and ratified 2 years later, the Founding Fathers declared, quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," end quote, legally obligating the government to construct boundaries around its religious activities and prohibiting it from infringing upon the religious freedoms of their citizens, a clause commonly referred to as separation of church and state. However, similar to any written text, whether a constitutional fragment or a biblical verse, there have been various interpretations of this constitutional ethic since it was first conceived and etched into law. This paper, based on 4 months of research, in which I interviewed tens of lay people, religious leaders, and government officials, each involved in various aspects of interfaith dialogue in Los Angeles County, seeks to explore two distinct paradigms in the development and construction of religious plurality in civic society. The two paradigms I'm working with are the we and the I. I will also look at the nebulous role the government has taken in setting up these activities. By analyzing two specific examples of interfaith endeavors, the first a countywide phenomenon and the second limited to a specific city, I hope to deepen our understanding of how the civic realm is designed, thereby adding to our comprehension of how Americans are influenced in our religious lives. The case of Los Angeles County, Sheriff Baca and the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. In November 1998, Leroy Baca was first elected as Los Angeles County's 30th sheriff, thereby placing him in charge of the largest county population in the country. With approximately 9.9 inhabitants as of July 2002, a mass only exceeded by 8 states, Baca was granted command of 13,000 sworn and civilian personnel, the largest sheriff's department in the world. In Sheriff Baca's first term in office, he's now in his second term, he was re-elected in March 2002. In his first term in office, he decided to create a new position within his department, an unofficial, yet official, unofficial in the sense he was never sworn in, an unofficial field deputy who gets paid by the government, who would deal with activities involving the interfaith community. It seems as if Sheriff Baca felt that enhancing interfaith dialogue and activity within LA County was in the public's best interest, and thus was a legitimate activity in which the government could engage. Due to new hate crimes legislation passed in 1999 under President Bill Clinton, Sheriff Baca decided to combat criminal offenses carried out to, quote, bias, hatred, or prejudice based on the victim's real or perceived race, religion, ancestry, national origin, disability, gender, or sexual orientation. Sheriff Baca decided to combat these criminal offenses not only with the enforcement of the new federal legislation, but also with the creation of a new government position, which would develop positive relations with the various religious communities that exist in the county. As echoed in President Clinton's speech when passing the legislation, Sheriff Baca seems to have agreed that, quote, although our diversity is a godsend for us and the world of the 21st century, it is also the potential for old, haunting demons that are hard to root out of the human spirit. I could go into statistics here. I'll leave that out for a sec in regard to hate crime. What's most important in Los Angeles County, what's most important is that the number of hate crimes in Los Angeles County has clearly been on the rise, specifically from 2000 on to now, in the last 2 years. A phenomenon that has partially led Sheriff Baca to attempt to combat this trend vis-a-vis the creation of a new field deputy officer who would assist in decreasing the levels of ignorance of county citizens in regard to religious practices. Sheriff Baca designated Bishop Edward R. Turner for this new position, the pastor of Power of Love Christian Fellowship, a church located in Los Angeles, maintaining him as a paid government employee, yet choosing not to actually swear this new field deputy into office. Prior to the appointment, Bishop Turner had been involved in numerous community building and crisis intervention activities, such as chairing the Helping Our People Excel for Life, or the Hope Foundation, a nonprofit community-based organization focused on, quote, generating a sense of hope in the community. In addition, Bishop Turner had been part of the Clergy Council, a group of Los Angeles County religious leaders representing various faiths, including Sikhism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, and various Christian denominations, which was originally created to develop a positive relations between each other as religious leaders in the community, rather than act as an interfaith group per se, meaning they had breakfasts together, not necessarily to talk about interfaith issues and themes, but to congregate and develop relations with one another. Prior to Sheriff Baca's creation of the new field officer position, the group had monthly prayer breakfasts, yet following Bishop Turner's appointment, which took place in November 2000, the breakfasts became titled, quote, Sheriff's Prayer Breakfast, and Sheriff Baca began attending the monthly meetings. According to Bishop Turner, the county did not officially endorse these breakfasts, and the council received no financial assistance from the government. However, if the Sheriff of Los Angeles County decided to attend monthly breakfast titled Sheriff's Prayer Breakfast, does it matter whether or not the government actually paid for the food? For example, following the attacks of September 11th, 2001, Bishop Turner and his church organized a memorial service at Southwest Community College in LA, inviting numerous religious leaders and government representatives such as Sheriff Baca to join them. This event, like the Sheriff's Prayer Breakfast, was not under the official auspices of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, and yet clearly the Sheriff, as well as many uniformed Sheriff's Department officials, were in attendance, leaving the question of government endorsement of the service open to debate. There are other activities, however, that Bishop Turner has helped organize with the county as official events, such as Community Day, in which more than 25,000 people attended activities, including those geared towards religious awareness, job mentoring, and the distribution of food and clothes. The Clergy Academy, which was an activity, in which members of the Clergy Council spent a day with law enforcement officials learning about the process of how these government officials make their decisions in the field, as it were, thus assisting the greater community's understanding of this process, meaning if something happens with the police, how religious leaders can then relay their understanding of what actually went on the streets. Though it's not difficult at all to see the benefits of these activities for the greater county region, with many of these events, it is clear that not all religious traditions practiced in Los Angeles were represented. Some needed to be excluded, if for no other reason than due to logistical concerns surrounding these events. However, inclusive the Sheriff's Department and Bishop Turner attempt to be, they are bound to exclude some people. The council could not be involved with an event in which, for example, members from all of the following religious traditions would be represented, each of which does exist in Los Angeles County. Catholic Church, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, various Muslim sects, Jehovah's Witnesses, Buddhists, Baha'i, Seventh-day Adventists, Conservative Reform and Orthodox Jews, and Reconstructionist Jews, in addition to the hundreds of different Protestant Christian denominations. Simply put, if every religious faith were represented at these activities, there would be too many leaders involved. And though Los Angeles is arguably the most religiously diverse area in the world, this simply isn't possible to have every single religious denomination represented at these events. The second case I'm going to look at is not countywide, but is focused to one of the 88 cities located in Los Angeles County, Culver City. In fall 1998, 2 of the 5 members of the City Council of Culver City decided to create an interfaith organization comprised of members of each of the religious traditions practiced in Culver City. Their goal was to coordinate and facilitate activities for the Alliance, the Interfaith Alliance, to coordinate and facilitate activities that would help in community improvement and interfaith dialogue. It was the Council's hope that such an organization would help build better relations between members of the community as well as members of the community with the government. After the suggestion was agreed upon by the other members of the City Council, the Council contacted Don Rogers, the Director of Parks, Recreation, and Community Services, a man who not only worked for the city in the department dealing with community services, but who was also a minister. Rogers met with the City Council numerous times, and the city representatives eventually decided to send a letter out to each of the official religious organizations located in Culver City in hopes of creating an interfaith group. Soon thereafter, in December 1998, with the continued assistance of Rogers, those citizens interested in the group met and formed the Culver City Area Interfaith Alliance, an organization that has existed from that time until the present. As the City Council first envisioned, the Interfaith Alliance decided to focus on 2 distinct areas, community improvement and interfaith dialogue. Each of these 2 areas was understood by the group as being interconnected, both falling under the rubric of the Alliance's mission, which is, quote, to promote the exercise of faith and practice on religion in Culver City and adjacent areas, to cultivate a friendly, cooperative, and synergistic relationship between the city's government and religious communities, and to build partnerships among the congregations to develop effective ministries for Culver City residents. The Alliance decided that assisting in community services and developing interfaith dialogue were activities that should be done alongside one another. Thus, the group decided to function in the following areas: combating homelessness, sustaining a local food pantry, strengthening the family unit, job training, and developing after-school youth programs. In addition to these services, the group decided to regularly meet once per month to discuss issues relevant to members from each different faith. In addition, among other activities, they decided to participate as a group in the World Day of Prayer Pilgrimage Walk, where participants visited and prayed in various houses of worship on a chosen route around the city, walking from the temple of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, ISKCON, of Culver City to the Culver City Presbyterian Church. They also were involved in interfaith intergenerational picnic, where participants shared food and family fun in a park setting, that's a quote, and a communal interfaith celebration of the national holiday of Thanksgiving. From the inception of the group, the City Council has made it clear that they would not offer the Alliance any financial assistance. This is from Don Rogers, who's, again, he's the Director of Parks and Recreation for the city. Though the Interfaith Alliance has received minimum monetary assistance in the forms of photocopying and sending out mailings that are put together in government environments, and in the actual time that those such as Rogers have dedicated to the group, which is obviously time where he's on the clock of the city, per se, the individual members of the group have quite often been asked to split the costs, the few times when there has been costs that things have been paid for. In addition, the city has not offered the Interfaith Alliance government space to hold any of their meetings or activities. All of their events, unless it's a public event, take place in houses of worship. Public event meaning if they had a picnic or such. The City Council has officially decided that in offering the group financial help, in the words of Rogers, quote, they would be crossing over the line separating church and state. According to Rogers, the line that must not be crossed is the one that separates the, quote, promoting of religious activity from the facilitation of social services. End quote. If the City Council opted to offer the Interfaith Alliance financial assistance, Rogers asserts that this might be perceived as favoring one religious organization over another, even though the City Council originally offered membership to each religious tradition officially found in the city, meaning they sent out letters to every single religious organization in the city. So it's interesting that his worries and concerns might be that if they give money to the Interfaith Alliance, which was open up to everyone, they still might be favoring some religious traditions over others. And his goal, he says, the city's goal is not to be perceived in this manner. The religious organizations in Culver City that Rogers is concerned about offending are precisely those groups that have opted not to join the Interfaith Alliance. One of these groups is the Culver City Foursquare Church. Though the leader of this church, Pastor Fred Barber, originally participated in some of the Interfaith Alliance's activities in the first year of their existence, soon thereafter he decided to stop his participation. When asked his reasons for making this decision, Pastor Barber said that the Interfaith Alliance's activities interfered with his primary goal, quote, to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is the continuation of the quote. My purpose is not just to be friends with everybody. Their purpose is to spread love and love everyone, but that isn't mine. My goal is to help people find salvation, which is an eternal goal, end quote. Pastor Barber is intent on pointing out that as a representative of his self-described Pentecostal church, he is involved with a Christian interdenominational group, represented by Baptists and Methodists, among others. But such a group, he says, despite their diversity within the Christian tradition, quote, all know that Jesus Christ is our Savior. This is important, says Barber, for the Interfaith Alliance's goal is a non-eternal issue, whereas the goal to spread the message of the possibility of gaining salvation through belief in Jesus Christ is eternal. Because the Interfaith Alliance is engaged in, quote-unquote, according to Barber's understanding, quote-unquote, religious activities, and because there are many non-Christian members of this group, such as Buddhists, Muslims, etc., by participating in the group, Pastor Barber feels that he would be condoning the devotion of these other devotees of other faiths. Quote, the saying, all roads lead to Rome, is not accurate. Jesus Christ said, I am the way, and any other ways are not true. End quote. But lack of membership is not limited to Christian groups, despite the fact that almost all groups that have decided to not participate are affiliated with Christianity. A second group that has decided not to join is the Venice Hongwang Buddhist Temple. According to Reverend John Iwahara of the Buddhist Temple, there are two main reasons why his temple is not represented in the Interfaith Alliance. The first is simply logistical. Reverend Iwahara's temple is currently in a state of transition, and Reverend Iwahara himself has only recently taken on the role of his community's religious leader. The second reason, however, is theological, or at least theological in my understanding. According to Reverend Iwahara, members from his temple do not want to join the Culver City group because the way that the Alliance members speak about God is very Judeo-Christian. That's a quote. Though the Reverend was quick to point out that this theological exclusion is, quote-unquote, surely unintentional, the Alliance is not perceived by this Buddhist community as entirely inclusive. The construction of the civic realm. From the two case examples described above, the county-wide activities of Field Deputy Turner and the LA Sheriff's Department and the citywide activities of the Culver City Interfaith Alliance, it is evident that there were two specific visions dictating how the civic realm of Los Angeles should be constructed in terms of interfaith community. The visionaries of the first image are found in both the government and the private spheres, and theoretically support an all-inclusive representative community. For example, Bishop Turner maintains that he and Sheriff Baca have attempted to be as inclusive as possible in organizing these events. Similarly, leaders of the City Council of Culver City, as well as the Culver City Interfaith Alliance itself, both maintain that the Alliance should be an organization that represents as many of the different religious traditions that exist in Culver City. These people are attempting to create interfaith activities that are inclusive. The construction of interfaith endeavors that generates, in the words of Harvard University professor Diana Eck, a civic culture of we. As Eck explains in her book, A New Religious America, whereas, quote, the American Constitution begins, we the people of the United States, in an era when the we is being defined in narrower terms, in many parts of the world, when the we is the we of ethnic, religious, or national chauvinism, America's we has continued so far to be elastic and expansive. Eck continues in saying, quote, diversity alone does not constitute pluralism, similarly to what Professor Machacek was saying earlier and last night. This is a quote from Eck, whether we are able to work together across the lines of religious difference to create a society in which we actually know one another is quite another matter. End quote. The visionaries of the civic culture of we agree with this idea. arguing that only through interfaith dialogue can true societal religious pluralism be attained. However, it's also clear that although the intentions of both those representing Los Angeles County and Culver City surely intend to support a culture of we, groups in each environment have also marginalized some religious traditions, thereby creating an I scenario within the we. Even though each of the people involved in supporting the we paradigm are attempting to develop closer relationships between those in the community, the we is not fully inclusive. For example, with the case of Los Angeles County, organizers of interfaith events have de facto created a hierarchy of importance of religious traditions, solely based upon who is and who is not chosen to participate in countywide activities. Likewise, although the Interfaith Alliance has intended to organize activities that are inclusive of all existent religious organizations in Culver City, they have unintentionally excluded some groups, such as the Buddhist temple, due to the manner in which they have constructed their theological discussions, although this is clearly from the vantage point of those from the Buddhist temple. In contrast, those religious organizations that opt not to participate in interfaith activities have certainly taken an I approach to the civic realm. Religious groups such as the Culver City Foursquare Church and the Venice Buddhist Temple have each decided that they do not want to be part of the Alliance, the Interfaith Alliance, although each for very different reasons. But just as the we paradigm can be deconstructed into much more complex substrata, so can the I. For example, according to Pastor Barber, he does support interfaith dialogue. However, only those different faiths that are represented within Christianity. Thus, the Christian interdenominational group that he participates is indicative of a we within the I. In conclusion, there are two major paradigms for the construction of interfaith activity within the civic realm, the we and the I. However, it is also evident that even those who subscribe to both the we and the I paradigms do not hold monolithic positions. Those in the we have oftentimes created boundaries around their community, despite their best intentions, and some of those in the I are also involved in we activities. In short, it is clear that the issue of the construction of religion and civic society is far from complete, and is an issue that is here to stay. Thus, the tension between the we and the I paradigms is an unfinished story.
I arrive at West Angeles Church of God in Christ at 9 a.m. on a Thursday morning. I enter a red velour sanctuary filled not with the typical Sunday morning church crowd, but instead overflowing with photographers, reporters, clergy members, politicians, and dozens of uniformed police officers. A projection on the front wall reads, "The Los Angeles Police Department working in partnership with the West Angeles Church of God in Christ to reduce crime in the community." The chief of police approaches the podium and thanks churches for taking ownership of their community, for building bridges of trust among politicians, religious leaders, businesses, and law enforcement. "We cannot do the work of eliminating gang violence in the streets alone," he says, "and today is the first step towards needed collaborative efforts." The mayor steps up to applaud a move into the community by both churches and law enforcement. Churches are reaching out to communities like never before, out of the sanctuary and into the community, just as the police department has moved into the community. People look to churches for hope, he says. Then the pastor of West Angeles Church of God in Christ approaches the podium. He reminds everyone that we are in church. Just because we're in a meeting, we can't act like we haven't been saved. Praise the Lord. Can I get an amen? This is a new ministry between black churches and law enforcement, he says, one that is about mobilizing our own troops to enter battle in the most violent neighborhoods. Because your children hold your community hostage. These are sins of previous generations, a lack of fathers and mentorship. If you pick any neighborhood, you'll find a drug dealer, but you won't always find a church. As a result of the church not taking their message to the streets have come into the church with theirs. And we can no longer use this justification of racism. Racism does not explain why a black boy shot at my black son. No longer can we play the race card as young people are drowning in their own blood. A lot of us want the crown, but we won't take on the cross. It will start in the black churches, he says. I say black because I am black, and that's what I know. I don't know the rest. In other cities, we've been able to transform the nature of political discourse. Now it is time to do it in LA, because if you can fix it in LA, you can fix it anywhere. We want to build a movement and start a process to bring hope where hope is gone. I wanted to start out with that account of my visit to the first ever community CompStat meeting, which is a collaborative effort between the LAPD and black churches in Los Angeles in order to combat gang violence. The reason I wanted to give you a small portion of the way that language was used is because language in social service by religious groups is so extremely vital in understanding their approaches, their motivation. The discourse that they employ is very dramaturgical in nature. We have the theatrical curtain background. I don't know if you can notice, but this is very much about the dramaturgy that's enacted by various faith groups in LA as they do social service. The guiding questions in my research that I sought to explore in having these conversations with various groups included: how do faith-based groups engage in social service within a context of religious and cultural pluralism? And then how does this play into ideas of what ultimately the role of religion is in public life? I sought to answer these questions by speaking to a number of different individuals from various types of social service groups founded by religious and faith-based groups. I also attended conferences and spoke to a number of individuals informally, as well as doing content analysis of organizational documents that are put online by various groups. Some of the key informants that I'd like to draw from for this particular presentation include the Buddhist Tzu Chi Free Clinic in Los Angeles, the Christian Community Development Association 2002 conference, which was in November, Building Bridges here in Santa Barbara, which is a collaboration of faith groups and government organizations and secular organizations towards efforts of social justice. Orange County Islamic Foundation, their outreach committee, the Faith Initiative in Santa Barbara, and the Faith Community CompStat meeting, which is what I was referring to earlier, held in Los Angeles. In these conversations that I had, I started to hear a number of different ways to talk about social service. Different faith perspectives would bring in different languages of faith, languages of service, and they were expressed in different ways. And so part of my processing was trying to read all these things and understand when people were telling me this type of language, what it meant collectively for the role of social service for faith groups in the public sphere. I was able to conceptualize these collectively, realizing that there is an emerging spectrum of discourse that exists in the social service provision of faith groups. This is a spectrum that is contested in the public square, one that has distinct ends, and groups fall along different places along this spectrum in the discourse that they use to describe the motivation behind social service. On one end, we have groups who define social service as a reclamation of Protestant-based rhetoric and hegemony in the public arena. So this resonates with much of what we've heard in this conference already. Groups who actively seek to re-implement a very explicitly Christian agenda in the public sphere. These are groups that blame the loss of this Christian morality in society on the sins of generations. This is where the social ills come from. It's this loss of Christianity. And so much of their mission is about trying to reinstate morality in the public sphere as they see it, which comes through ways of Christianity. So obviously in this group, group, I'm talking particularly about evangelical Christian groups, and in the conversations that I had, it was best exemplified by a multitude of individuals I spoke to at the Christian Community Development Association conference, and then also the language that was employed in this ComStat meeting that I mentioned earlier. On the other end of the spectrum, we have groups who define social service more so as a means of performing civic duties and working towards social justice and mutual respect. Oftentimes, religious language is still employed by these groups, but it's watered down, or it's melded down until it's a language more so of social respect, about a common humanity, a common civic duty that collectively we can engage in. Regardless of particular religious denominational ties or religious affiliations or faith backgrounds that one has, these things can still emerge, and this approach can be taken towards social service. These groups find the conversations and dialogue, interfaith dialogue extremely crucial to the work that they do. Oftentimes this is the first place they start. However, I should mention too that they also focus on the ends more so than the means. Whereas on this side of the spectrum, if the means are dissimilar, if social service is not done in efforts to spread the gospel, for example, then it doesn't matter if you're trying to eradicate poverty or other social ills. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, groups can collectively work around these ideas of charity and bringing in their own religious perspectives, but pluralistically approaching a social service end. In the middle are groups, perhaps not so much in the middle, but drawing from each side or still negotiating their place in the public sphere. But new immigrant groups have a special place in here. They see social service as a way potentially for new immigrant groups to establish legitimacy by participating in collectively valued social services. This was a trend that came out in my conversations with groups who did have a certain percentage of immigrant population in their social service entities. Through their social service, they were able to take on these notions of what it meant to be American, what it means to be American, and how that's tied into social service, and how in doing social service, these groups are able to establish their place, establish legitimacy for recognition of their religion in some cases that has not been recognized before, or their particular faith perspective. Oftentimes these groups have to first start with these processes of legitimization before they can even conduct the social service. In speaking to the woman at a Buddhist Suchi Free Clinic, she spoke of having to establish themselves to the Red Cross, for example, because initially the Red Cross had hesitancy in allowing a Buddhist group to do these services. They needed to first be assuaged of their fears and their misunderstanding about it before this work could be done. Other themes that have emerged through my conversations include the need and the presence for interfaith dialogue and collaboration. Now, groups have different views on this. A quote here by a woman I spoke to from Building Bridges. It can't work if we don't have everybody working together, anyway, in our belief system. I'm sure others don't believe the same. She's right, others don't believe the same. Just as was mentioned in the last presentation, for some groups it is more difficult to form these interfaith dialogues, this interfaith collaboration, whereas for others it's a necessity to do the type of social justice work that they want to do in their communities, which are diverse in many ways. For some groups also, the interfaith dialogue is not as necessary because the public sphere is already set up in a way for them to be able to get right in and do the work, and they don't have to, as in the example of the Buddhist Suchi Free Clinic, they don't have to go through these processes of legitimization. The public arena is already set up for them to be able to enact in particular social service agendas. Another theme that emerged is social service as a mediator. So when you are having these groups come together, interfaith groups, interfaith collaborations with the government, whatnot, oftentimes these groups can work around particular agendas. For example, the Faith Initiative, one of the first and foremost agendas that they have taken is one of housing. And this is something that a number of different groups of all sorts can come together collectively around, and then from there work through differences of faith perspectives. Quote here from the woman at the Buddhist Free Clinic. Whenever we approach another religious organization, the always initial contact is charity work. A third theme that has emerged is one of racial reconciliation. This was extremely prominent at the CCDA conference, the Christian Community Development Association. There was even a cameo appearance by Rodney King, who invited us all to just get along. Here we have, in doing this interfaith work and doing the work that evangelicals Christians do, also there is this constant recognition of racial divides, of cultural differences that still need to be talked about and circumvented and understood and implemented in the type of service work that's being done. These issues are coming much more to the forefront. I think I was surprised how much issues of race came up in my conversations. So I think that these, although not alleviated, I think they are at least a high part of the conversation. For example, here a quote from a speaker at the conference: "Come together in consensus, all the people, under the skin, all people are kin. California and America are becoming black and brown. We're going to have to figure out a formula to deal with it." So the formula may not be there yet, but they are having these conversations oftentimes. Another additional theme that came up was one of government partnerships and faith-based initiatives. This is there's a diversity of opinion on forming relationships with the government, some of which we've already heard about during this conference. The conversations that I had, a number of different opinions emerged on this. For example, here's one that we even heard in a comment by someone after Gus Niebuhr's speech yesterday. Similar quote here: "We have a separation of church and state, but that doesn't mean they can't work together." So here's this vision that, yes, there is technically this church-state division, and yet there are many collaborations being formed, but it's interesting to see what kinds of collaborations are indeed being formed, as we've heard some of during this conference. Another opinion on this is expressed by the Buddhist Free Clinic, which is an organization that has chosen not to accept government funding for fear that it would alter their purpose and their mission and their ability to do the type of social service that they want to do, particularly with undocumented immigrants. Here she says, "We don't get any grants from government. We want to have the freedom to serve the community in needs. We realize that if we got grants from government, we'd have to comply with the law and requirement." And then we have groups who have yet to come to the forefront or even know enough about faith-based initiatives and government funding. This conversation is one that I had with a Muslim man who's on the outreach committee for the Orange County Islamic Foundation, and his comment is extremely vital to consider. He says, "I've read in the newspaper that the president has a faith-based initiative. I have no clue what that means. We haven't heard about it. Nobody's approached us with it. I don't think it's well communicated. I don't want to be judgmental and pass anything, but I think so far it's kind of like it's certain faith-based groups, not all." This is a very different story than what I heard at the Christian Community Development Association. They had several workshops on how to get funding from the government, how to form these collaborative partnerships in order to achieve ministry in the public sphere. So these are the primary findings that I've had, and I'm curious to hear feedback, particularly from those of you who are directly involved in this type of work, to hear if this spectrum seems to apply, if you can see yourself on one aspect or another of this particular spectrum. So that's all I have for today, and if you do want to contact me, I have my email address up there too. Thank you.
I was initiated into the world of religion, public education, and pluralism with a few simple phone calls placed in autumn of last year, or at least I thought that they were going to be rather simple. As a researcher in examining the intricate relationships between these various social and cultural institutions, I thought that there was no better place to start than with the schools themselves. I was both right and very, very wrong. For what followed was one of the more confusing yet simultaneously enlightening portions of this research project. Perhaps I can explain this paradox best by relating the nature of these initial encounters. They involved contacting one Southern California superintendent's office after another, informing their representatives that I was researching how public schools handled the challenges of religious pluralism. Upon hearing my request, various representatives of the schools indicated that, although they were unsure who handled the issue, or even at times what it was, I was to be assured that, quote, they all got along very well. I was transferred at least an average of 5 times per phone call placed, and I certainly am no mathematician, but I was keenly aware of this number. Often to curriculum departments and to media offices, uncertain how to handle the question that I posed. Even when these questions asked things like, if a Muslim student who covers her head and is harassed at school, who would we contact? This trend reached its highest point when I found myself in the uncomfortable yet very interesting position of having to inform the superintendent's office of one major diverse school district in Southern California of the dissolution of their own Office of Diversity, news that had not made it through all the channels of their bureaucratic network. This was my introduction to the crossroads of religious pluralism and the public education system. And it was a prologue that was not too far removed from some of the things that I've gleaned about the interaction between the two. The public education system in America has, from its beginning, represented an attempt to instill in the nation's children knowledge that is deemed vital in the development of both good and productive citizens. It's one of those instruments of socialization that we've long known to set the standard for those qualities that are considered valuable in the American democratic experiment. But how this is achieved and what those terms good and productive mean in the climate of diversity that Southern California offers represents one of the most significant present and future challenges had by the public education system. With an interest in how the practical matters of religious diversity are handled, but with a greater intrigue in the values that inspired such tactics, this project represents an effort to gauge and to question how representatives of some of the largest and most diverse public school systems in Southern California have attempted to handle, contextualize, and explain the challenges that pluralism brings to their public education systems. To flesh out these concerns, I conducted numerous interviews with past and present Southern California teachers, assistant principals, administrators, superintendents, and community leaders involved in the various school systems' efforts to grapple with religious pluralism. These interviews were centered on several items, including whether religious pluralism was even much of an issue within that particular school compared to other concerns like race, how day-to-day accommodations were made, how policies on religious pluralism were enacted, and the particular philosophy of that educator or community organization leader regarding religious diversity. So, as one might imagine, there are people in each of these districts working to handle the challenges of religious pluralism, and despite my initial experiences, I was able to reach some of them. The inability or confusion surrounding religious pluralism, however, is a very sharp signal of the complexity of the issues and perhaps even the priority that such topics are given. I believe that this investigation offers for educators and scholars of religion alike some very interesting perspectives on the value systems had by Southern California public education systems, the state of its biases and its will to remedy them, and general observations on how day-to-day religious accommodations actually work, and as a caveat, whether or not they do. From a larger standpoint, we can witness further illumination regarding how religion as a category has been understood within tolerance, respect, and pluralism rhetoric. As has been mentioned, within many diverse areas such as Southern California, curricula have changed to accommodate new shifting cultural patterns. With a school system as diverse as Los Angeles, for instance, which boasts over 92 distinct language groups, education is no longer about the 3 R's, but now must answer to a different type of educational standard. And that's one that asks not only for cultural literacy, but also demands cultural coping skills. Handling these new demands has involved both curricular and structural transformations. As many of you are likely aware, teaching about the world's great religions is a principle embraced by the state of California and is included in its mandatory curriculum. Often when students reach the upper grades of elementary school and basically into the junior high years, discussions on the socio-cultural roles of religion begin to appear in social studies and sometimes in the history curricula. At no time, of course, is a doctrinal presentation, or for that matter, an anti-religious presentation, to be tolerated. Many school systems also openly refer to a set of civic values upon which their curricula are based. These include a set of moral principles that, it is assumed, almost all persons of all backgrounds would want their children to learn. Although these values are rarely, if ever, explicitly stated, they are mentioned often in the context of discussions on diversity and conflict resolution. From reading many of the documents of this tenor and pinpointing their vocabularies of choice, one could fairly reasonably conclude that these values include things such as kindness, tolerance, respect, understanding, compassion, and responsibility. Now, to handle these curricular and what are often existing cultural challenges, many school systems do not rely solely on internal staffing to address religious and ethnic pluralism, but often call in outside agencies such as the Anti-Defamation League, Interfaith Alliances, and other community organizations to advise them, to address specific problems, and to conduct training sessions to be involved in the implementation of new programs. These changes get at a diversity that is so large that it demands attention in a way that cannot be ignored, and that was a persistent theme among the people that I interviewed. It has truly become a community effort to handle a diversity of this particular nature and size. The pool of educators and community leaders with whom I spoke shared numerous tactics, worldviews, techniques, and opinions about the state of religion in the public education system, which can be condensed into three major themes that I would like to use to guide our discussion today. First theme, religious pluralism is approached as something both to celebrate but also to control. Second, although it's valuable, such pluralism is treated as a real priority by school systems only in a crisis, and thus most schools' efforts towards handling religious diversity or grappling with those issues in the first place remain primarily reactive endeavors. And then the third theme, tolerance is not enough. Schools must shift their discussions and thus educate their children on the qualities of true respect for those from whom they differ. This means employing new tactics that foster interpersonal interaction between students so as to promote understanding. I want to return to that first one first. That religious pluralism is approached as something both to celebrate and to control. The religious and school representatives with whom I spoke voiced very, very strong support for pluralistic classrooms and the educational experiences that allow them, constantly alluding to the balance between free exercise and neutrality and the difficulty that they often have maintaining that. More ideologically, they report that incorporating extensive talk about respect for human differences was a major part of their daily classroom sessions. Yet these moments of celebration were dotted with the logistical concerns of handling the gargantuan religious and cultural diversities with which they were faced. Practically speaking, district representatives cited common efforts to accommodate students' religious holiday observances, their dietary restrictions, and their dress practices. This was expressed practically through things like a vegetarian offering in the school cafeteria, a rest rather than recess alternative for Muslim students fasting during Ramadan, as well as an alternate meeting area for fasting students during the lunch hour so that they would not be forced to sit in the cafeteria with their non-fasting classmates. A liberal make-up work policy for students who miss school because of a religious holiday is included, and the scheduling of standardized tests is often avoided during these time periods. Still, though, many of these policies remain very Judeo-Christian and oftentimes simply very Christian. One district, in what it cited was an attempt to honor pluralism, decided to call off school on the major Jewish holidays in addition to the Christian holidays that were already afforded that possibility. What this meant to the countless other religions represented in that district was not discussed. Another Jewish educator remarked to me that while some deference was shown to Jews, football games were still held on Friday nights, and a host of other school-sponsored events occurred on Fridays as well. More Christian symbols, in short, were given secular status than the symbols of any other culture, and thus found their way into the classroom more readily. These accommodations were not limited to the student body. Lest we believe that public education involves children only, we can consider the district I just mentioned, which incorporated Jewish holidays into the times when school was dismissed. While they explained such a move as one concerned with pluralism, more than one teacher from that district told me that they believed it was due to the high number of Jewish teachers who would be absent themselves on those holidays, juxtaposed with a waning substitute teacher pool. It was a very practical decision, in short. I was also continually told of many Muslim and Sikh teachers who, like their students, covered their heads, something the school system felt they needed to openly explain so as to alleviate any suspicions or concerns. Most schools did this by explaining the rationale behind these dress decisions as an individual expression of religion and urged students to treat the situation as normal. Yet normal is a very interesting word, particularly when looking at how some schools have chosen to explain certain behaviors. In the case of a group of Jehovah's Witnesses children who chose not to say the Pledge of Allegiance, one principal remarked, quote, "We have people with different backgrounds and we just talk very frankly with the kids about how there are people that are different and we respect those. And that doesn't mean that that person is not American or that they don't adhere to American values." Now, references to patriotism and normalcy, and sometimes the equation of the two, were constant, but no more so than in the discussion of the December dilemma. As might be expected, the issue of religious pluralism becomes far more tricky during the month of December. Attempting to put on a holiday music program while avoiding a Judeo-Christian emphasis has proven almost impossible for many districts, which often include a wide array of holiday songs from various traditions so that no one can make the argument that one religion was in the spotlight longer than another. Alternately, many attempt to uphold American values, which you might be interested to know include peace and tolerance. Still, many principals report that at least a couple of parents often complain each year about this mix of religious messages. It's one thing, it seems, to incorporate factual, cultural information about religion within the state curriculum, but it's another to engage children in songs and singing that, even if one part of a larger cultural sampling, involve a faith message or theme. Those involved with the Anti-Defamation League and other organizations note that they receive more complaints regarding religion and the schools during the month of December than at any other time. So with all of the accommodations that I've mentioned, most educators frankly report few problems in the realm of religion and public education. Those that do emerge almost always come from parents, an interesting point I thought, and not students who it seems want to fit in more than they want to rally for their religious rights. Generally, parental attitudes towards student acculturation is varied. One parent informed a principal that his son did not need to be educated in Arabic, his native language. Instead, he argued his son needed to learn English without an accent and was to embrace American culture as his culture. Alternately, a Jordanian parent informed the same principal that both his son and daughter would be sent back to Jordan upon reaching a certain age, as America's liberal culture jeopardized their adherence to Islam. On the issue of public school accommodation, the educators with whom I spoke indicated that those who were most vocal about their concerns with the values being taught in a pluralistic environment were often conservative Christians. They were almost all in agreement that the most conservative families of all religions would, and probably did, opt to homeschool or to take advantage of the private school system if possible for the very reason of values. It seems that for some, talk of normalcy, patriotism, and respect does not disguise the fact that pluralism involves a value confrontation, as David referenced, a new normative standard, sometimes even with those values that are deemed almost universally acceptable. The second point that I mentioned earlier that I'd like to return to now is that religious pluralism is a reactive concern given attention only in crisis. This point was one that was echoed very heavily by almost all of the interviewees involved in this project. Although almost all of the educators polled felt that they had not been adequately professionally trained to handle religious pluralism by any means, the blame could also be shifted somewhere else, and that blame needed to lie also with the school districts. The school system's concerns with religious pluralism were purely reactive in nature, they noted. One former administrator described this as a situation, quote, rife with benign neglect. Although there is an overarching desire, I think, to do the right thing. I don't think that the soul of the district is willful in its intention, end quote. In short, whether because of the overwhelming nature of other problems, such as funding, race relations, curricular standards, or because simple fixes were believed to resolve complex cultural issues, religious pluralism was a topic that received widespread attention only when a crisis was experienced, or perhaps more importantly, upon anticipation of a legal problem. Racial tensions were one significant reason why religion did not receive the attention it should, many offered. It is, in short, a much more pressing issue, that is race, and when religion comes into play, principals reported finding themselves dealing with religious intolerance as a manifestation of racial tensions. Because the mechanisms to accommodate most students of a variety of faiths are already in place, as I've earlier mentioned, religious hostilities were often coming out in the midst of pre-existing racial struggles. Overall, the standard by which many school representatives measured their success in handling religious pluralism was whether they heard about it. Silence in many places equals appropriate religious accommodation. A number of people mentioned that the low priority afforded pluralism in many districts was epitomized in the recent dissolution of the Intergroup Relations Office, a division of the Los Angeles Unified School District. as its name implies, intergroup relations was responsible for improving the relationships between various groups within the district through educational sensitivity training and mediation techniques. The educators interviewed agreed that its demise indicated a much larger problem. The school district failed to understand the importance of crafting bonds across racial, religious, and cultural divides, perhaps falsely believing, as one Anti-Defamation League representative mentioned, that putting policies in place would solve problems grounded in interpersonal expression. The third point that I mentioned earlier, that tolerance is not enough, that the situation must shift to understanding and respect, is one that we heard yesterday with Mr. Niebuhr's talk. And you will likely remember a discussion of how moving past the vocabulary of tolerance to that of respect was a key goal of many organizations and movements devoted to pluralism. This, too, was a very similar theme within public education circles, but it was particularly popular amongst the community and religious leaders who influenced the working of the schools, and who had an overt set of goals designed to foster mutual religious respect and understanding. Community leaders often mentioned that programs encouraging interpersonal interaction between students of different backgrounds were glaringly absent from the public school curricula. While some smaller scale programs do exist, they do so on a trial basis only, and they are not offered district-wide. When talk of expanding one particular program's scope came up for debate, for instance, it was dismissed by one California legislator whose charge it was to secure its funding as too touchy-feely, and although admired by the superintendent, was ultimately not approved. Those who are promoting the inclusion of interpersonal experiences under the auspices of cultural education argue that neither classroom content nor, quote, sensitivity training gets one past ignorance, the fodder from which hatred and fear are bred. Certainly the interpersonal model is making great strides in promoting better understanding among students and more harmonious campuses, as all involved in these preliminary educational experiments report. Yet the inclusion of the values of respect in the classroom, again what David referred to as this new normative standard, demands that we examine the other side of pluralism, the recognition that the civic values taught in schools are not consistent with all religions. In short, they are hardly universal, and thus we must ask what it is that compromises the civic. The understanding of religion carved out by the schools is an image very much in line with modern respect rhetoric, which attempts to value diversity while simultaneously searching for a common thread or human trait that might align an otherwise multiplicitous population. Thus, much of it hinges on the assumption that people want to get along, or that their religions bear fundamentally identical or at least similar qualities, so much so that they would be able to see across the issues that divide them. As one brochure on religious liberty and public education used in the LA schools noted, quote, "This is not an attempt to ignore or minimize differences that are important and abiding, but rather a reaffirmation of what we share as American citizens across our differences. Democratic citizenship does not require a compromise of our deepest convictions. We invite all men and women of goodwill to join us in affirming these principles and putting them into action." Now, who gets to count as persons of goodwill is an interesting discursive strategy. Those against respect for other religions are often not hate mongers on the fringe of society, but comprise significant portions of the American experience. And by this brochure standard, perhaps they may be ineligible for democratic citizenship. I think of much of my own work on Protestant fundamentalism as an example. Many Protestant fundamentalist groups would strongly object to some of the civic values offered up in the California public schools. There is no room for respecting someone else's religion when doing so would dishonor one's image of God. Even if one can manage to tolerate another's beliefs or learn more about them, such behaviors might very easily be motivated by the desire to use this knowledge as a conversion tool, an incentive far removed from the aims of pluralism proponents. In this case, it becomes clear that while ignorance may breed suspicion and fear, its opposite does not necessarily resolve it. With these concerns posed, how does this practically play out in the Southern California schools? I believe that the many layers of diversity constantly negotiated by Southern Californians means that even if a parent is disturbed by the inclusion of a Jewish song in a December program or objects to the education about religions other than their family's own in the school's curriculum, which they often do, they understand that living here means that there is a compromise involved toward the values embraced by the larger community. In a remark about Los Angeles that can be applied to the entire region, one Anti-Defamation League representative told me that Los Angeles handles diversity fairly well because it is diversity. The picture one is left with is of a highly diverse set of school systems that do the best that they can to honor pluralism, although blatantly Christian and often Western biases peek through. They involve who they can to fight the fires that exist, while perhaps spending too little time searching or planning for the presence of future embers. They rely on a set of values that many find acceptable, but that some, to use the language of this conference, must merely tolerate. In all of this, we up the ante, of course, when we involve people's children, a population perceived not only as most precious but also most vulnerable. In light of these complexities that have come forth in this project, I would like to complicate things much further by proposing the following potentially unanswerable questions that, I believe, must be considered by public education systems. First, how does one differentiate between a sacred value and a secular value, and who gets to make these decisions? Second, how is the current involvement of community agencies devoted to religious pluralism different from a particular church's involvement with the schools? Since both speak in the name of a certain set of values, both of which endorse certain normative standards, how do we determine what makes one acceptable while the other crosses a line? Again, a reference back to the first question. And thirdly, and there are many, many more, but I think three complications will do it. If religious respect rhetoric promotes respect and understanding amongst all religions, is it itself really all that respectful of all diversities if it would require that some religious systems revise or remove what they perceive to be some of their most valuable qualities, their separatism and their exclusivism, in order to be respectful? In other words, is religious tolerance and respect rhetoric willing to tolerate the intolerant and respect the disrespectful? And what are the implications of this step? I propose these questions not to undermine the work, by any means, that has gone on in the name of pluralism, but to demonstrate how incredibly complex the answers must be if the questions are of this nature, especially in the diversity had by this region. Describing the intersection between education, religion, and pluralism cannot be about creating artificial dichotomies that separate conservative extremists and hate-mongers from their liberal, diversity-loving counterparts. Nor can it be boiled down to a discussion of the sacred versus the secular. It is instead just another symptom of the continuous negotiations that go on regarding the definitions of religion, those things that constitute education, and the borders of public and private life, all of which have a very unique way of shifting just as soon as we think that we have our hands on them. Thank you.
Well, we have plenty of time to take some questions and comments from people here in the audience. There's a couple of folks in the back that will be coming around with microphones. Again, please, if you have a question, wait until a microphone reaches you to ask it. So do you have any questions or comments for any of these panelists?
I'm Steve Prothero. I always have something to say if no one else is willing to. I really liked what Leslie said at the end. I think that I have some concerns about the celebratory nature of the pluralism rhetoric. And I'm going back now to David's brief history of this ideal of pluralism in the U.S. And he basically told this meta-narrative that's been around since the 60s in my field, that the story is from Protestantism to pluralism, and that the appropriate response to the story is a standing ovation. In other words, this is a good thing. And we're moving from the Dark Ages to the light, but the intimation also in what David had to say was that with each response to the other, to these other folks, whether it's melting pot assimilationism or pluralism, carries with it certain values and also then certain institutions. And it strikes me that all of them also carry a notion of who's excluded from them, right? And that's obvious in the case of what David called the Protestant assimilation model, right? The Catholics are excluded, and then in World War II they're included, and it's it's Christian instead of Protestant, and then it's Judeo-Christian, and now the Jews are included. But so my question is, what does pluralism exclude? What boundaries does it draw? And it seems to me part of the sleight of hand that goes on with pluralism rhetoric is that it doesn't exclude anybody. And yet when some of the folks last night at dinner were saying, well, we can't get the Christians to come, and we can't get the born-agains to come. The Orthodox Jews don't want to come. Well, why don't they want to come? Because the rhetoric excludes them. So it seems to me that that's something to consider as scholars, if we have this celebratory response to what's going on, and at the same time, some of the people we're supposed to be studying are are excluded by the rhetoric that we're using. So I raise that as a part critique and part question as someone who uses this rhetoric too.
Is there anybody in particular you're addressing that question to?
Maybe to Leslie,
Okay.
since I think she might say what I want her to say.
Well, since you've agreed with me, perhaps I'll agree with you. Who knows? Well, one of the things that I was really trying to bring out in this research that became evident to me almost immediately was something that I don't know that I mentioned specifically here, but I'll bring it up now. When I was contacting not the school systems themselves, but the various community and interfaith agencies who inform these large school systems in Southern California, what I was immediately hearing was excitement and enthusiasm over my phone call, which of course I appreciated. But what their excitement and enthusiasm stemmed from the fact that they assumed that because I was affiliated with a large university and a well-known religious studies department, that I was their ally in their fight for to promote, as David has referenced, a meaningful pluralism. And that vision of me as an ally, although my personal views never came into the discussion whatsoever, was a very interesting thing to me, because it does seem to me that although many of us, and probably many of us in the room, are intrigued by the topic of pluralism because we want to embrace it in some fashion, I think that's probably a very fair comment. On the other hand, it does seem to be pretty obvious that when we talk about respect rhetoric, and of course I don't use the term rhetoric in any pejorative sense, but when we talk about respect rhetoric, what we are talking about is respect for the things that I respect. And I don't know that, and this is why I asked the question whether respect rhetoric was willing to respect who they can consider to be the disrespectful. Tolerance and respect rhetoric tolerate certain values that they believe to be universal, and then don't understand to a large extent when individuals do not embrace that universality, which never described them in the first place. And so, to some extent, I am very, very intrigued by tolerance and pluralism rhetoric, because I believe that it paints a vision of the world that is far more homogeneous than how the world actually is. The brochure that I mentioned that said that we are not asking people to divorce themselves from their deepest convictions, I don't know that that's altogether true. If a Christian fundamentalist's deepest conviction is that they are on the straight and narrow path to heaven because of their belief in Jesus Christ, as you mentioned, then asking them to engage in the types of alliances and respect rhetoric that would involve making accommodations to other religious groups does mean asking them to some extent to make that sort of compromise and accommodation. So it's a very interesting jumble. It's absolutely fascinating to me to see the interspersement of all of these different issues, because while we want to give people plenty of room to express themselves freely, on the other hand, we do find that what freely means, as you mentioned, is a limited category.
We have a question.
First of all across the board, excellent presentations. Yes. Really, very, very good. My question is, I guess, to any of you and all of you, I hope. I'm really, somewhere along the line in undergrad, I got interested in Supreme Court cases in relation to religion. And it seems like all of you touched on issues that a lot of the cases, important cases in the Supreme Court, have always touched on, especially with funding and public funds, public resources, public space. In any of your researches, did you find any instructive Supreme Court examples in Southern California? Because I can't seem to remember any that related to Southern California, but yet when we're talking about Southern California and that is this great pluralistic place, or at least a lot of people are thrown into this mix. I mean, do these problems get to the level of high court, problems that are fought all the way to the high court, or are they resolved, or what's going on with those kinds of issues?
I wish I could answer that. I know that there have been some cases that have come out of cases concerning religion in the public schools that have come out of the state of California. Now, Southern California in particular, I'm afraid I can't say. But of course, the most recent one to come to national attention was the case concerning the inclusion of the words "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance, which is still being contested.
But apart from that, I'm afraid I have to confess ignorance on what other cases have come out of Southern California in particular.
I think it's interesting. I just can't remember it either.
We have Mason, and then you're next.
Hi, I'm Mason Elis, and I wanted to make a statement that might be something of a rehashing of Steve's excellent question, but I want to sort of rephrase one angle to you in response to your response to Steve. And that is this fascination that you have with the conflicts in the use of what you're calling respect rhetoric and the potential butting of heads between pluralist agenda and the agenda of some groups. The one that you mentioned as an example would be evangelical Christian groups that have an exclusive vision of truth. Isn't another way of putting this, and I guess what I'm asking is, it seems to have a very different flavor, but sort of the same ideological issue. Wouldn't it be very different for us to say, well, really the issue is not will the people with the respect rhetoric respect the disrespectful, but to say, will the people with the respect rhetoric respect the normativity of their own position? In other words, rather than seeing a level playing field and some people are willing to play ball and other people aren't, and we'll call the people who aren't willing to play ball disrespectful, how would it change things to describe both parties or all parties as being involved in the negotiation as equal partners?
I think that's a really excellent point. Can you hear me okay if I sit back here? Okay. That's a really good point. I think we're getting at a similar thing, but have said it in two different ways. One of the things that I was attempting to critique, in examining how this research and how religion and education all came together, was the notion that respect rhetoric was seen by many of its proponents as a universal solution. So the acknowledgement of its own normativity, I think, would go far in seeing the limitations of the rhetoric itself. So I think you've made an excellent point, yeah.